You therefore should not have the audacity to impose on the society you live in, let alone the world, your narrow, uni-ideological orientation. Therefore, we, the resistance fighters of Uganda, are flabbergasted and look down with contempt at the philosophical, ideological, and strategic shallowness of some of the actors of the world.
That was Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni speaking at the opening of the Non-Aligned Movement Summit in Uganda, which took place between the 15th and the 20th of January. And this was closely followed by the G77 Plus China Summit, also in Kampala. The Non-Aligned Movement, or NAM, and the G77 Plus China are coalitions of countries from the Global South. NAM is a forum of 120 countries that are not formally aligned with or against any major power bloc, while the G77 Plus China is designed to promote its members' collective economic interests and joint negotiating power within the United Nations. On this special edition of the program, jointly produced with Uganda Broadcasting Corporation, we delve deeper into the importance of the summits and what their roles are in the geopolitics today. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Well, the Non-Aligned Movement Summit in Kampala was the 19th meeting of the movement. It is not a summit that is often heard about, but due to the increased significance of the Global South, the importance of the Non-Aligned Movement and the G77 Plus China is growing. Well, before we begin our discussion, we cross over to my colleague Edward Rukidi Kijanangoma, who is joining us from the Uganda Broadcasting Corporation studio in Kampala. Edward, thank you for joining us on Talk Africa today. First off, what has been the significance for Uganda in hosting the two summits?
Thank you, Beatrice, for having us. And yes, talking about the importance of Uganda hosting these two great summits, one thing that actually came out from the summit was that there should be cooperation between the member states, both of NAM and the G77 plus China, in as far as doing trade, because we are looking at development of these partner states within NAM and G77. And so they emphasize on trade, but for that to happen, there must be cooperation between these member states of NAM and G77. President Yoweri Museveni, of course, in his opening remarks, he emphasized on the importance of trade. And I think as Uganda, as East Africa, as Africa, we can leverage on what is already in place in as far as promoting trade and also learning from the other developed nations within NAM and G77 to learn from them how they have made it in as far as trade and development of their economies is concerned. But joining me in the studio to shed more light on what happened is the Minister, Uganda's Minister for ICT and National Guidance, Dr. Chris Baryomunsi. Doctor, hello and welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, Edward, and greetings to the viewers. I'm happy to be invited in the studios here.
Yes, I'd like to start with the importance of these two summits that took place, but especially in today's geopolitical climate. How significant is this?
No, these two summits are very important and extremely significant in the sense that when you look back why these countries decided to come together, like the non-aligned movement. Yes, they came together in 1961. That's way far back. And that's a time when the world was polarized. The American-led capitalism and the Soviet Union, the Cold War. Even when the Cold War collapsed, still the objectives, the principles, the reasons for which countries came together to say we are non-aligned remain relevant. For instance, NAM pushed for decolonization, fighting for countries which were colonized to become independent and enjoy sovereignty, and the question of sovereignty, the question of mutual respect, the question of being able to exercise our rights as developing countries still remains relevant. And then the G77 plus China, that brings together 135 countries. Again, they came together as a grouping within the context of UN to push for economic interests. Those economic interests remain relevant when it comes to the developing world, because countries which constitute NAM and G77 plus China, or the South-South, the global South, are largely countries which we see in the axis of developing countries. And definitely the outcome document and the declarations that come out of these summits are going to go a long way in shaping decision-making and also for the benefit of the people in the global South.
Yes, because actually, Honorable, the other question that I wanted to ask you are the key outcomes, from both summits, and what is your take?
As we appreciate the discussions which were held in Kampala, I think the themes were along political affairs, like looking at the global peace. There was a call for cessation of hostilities and all working for peace, because the world is now ravaged by conflicts.
Yes, yes.
Be it in the global north, but also in the south. In Africa, a number of countries, in Asia and Middle East, even part of Latin America,
yes,
but also, of course, like the Russia, Ukraine. So these conflicts, it was a major discussion that we should put a stop to these conflicts and focus on development, focus on improving the quality of life of our people that we lead. That was very significant. And looking at how do we enable countries which are in a developing bracket be able to access international resources, say from World Bank, from UN agencies, from IMF, at terms and conditions which are favorable, because there was a concern.
Yes.
Why do these countries get money, but the terms are quite harsh, whereas others, which are affluent and probably much better off,
their terms are not
their terms are not as harsh? That's the key question which was raised, which the leadership of NAM and G77 definitely are going to be pushing. And 2030 is not very far from today. We just have 6 years to go, and we are not doing well on a number of indicators, a number of SDGs. And therefore, this discussion was extremely important, and the delegates left Kampala with that resolve to do everything possible to make sure that we meet these targets and objectives.
Yes, Honorable, and also I remember in his opening remarks, President Museveni, he lashed out at especially the Western world for what he calls oppression of the third world and imposed ideologies during his opening speech at the NAM summit. Now, could you please break this down for us?
Of late, you have seen how the communities in the West try to impose their views, their opinions on us, we who are in the developing world. And the President, Yoweri Museveni, was right to say that we live in a global community where we should respect each other, because we are sovereign countries. Uganda got independence 1962, over 60 years ago. So why should you, country X somewhere, think that you should impose your view on Uganda, which is a sovereign country? And that's the point he was making, that we should promote mutual respect, and that we cannot be the same. There are things which are cherished and espoused by us in the developing world. Yes. There are those which are popular with the Western world. But so how can we coexist? And we don't impose our views on the West, but also the West should not impose their views on us. That's the point. I can give an example. This question of homosexuality, yes, sexual orientation, it has caused some sort of division. We recently passed a law here in Uganda and we pass laws in the interest of Ugandans, not to please anybody. But sections of the West are quite apprehensive and have turned hostile to Uganda and other countries that have the same view, simply because we made a law. And we are saying, for us in Uganda, given our background, our tradition, and what we believe in, our values, we do not cherish same-sex relationships, period.
But also now, President Yoweri Museveni is the chairman of NAM for the next 3 years. In which direction do you think the president will be taking NAM?
Yes, President Yoweri Museveni is a very experienced leader, greatly respected not only in the continent of Africa but across the globe. In the next 3 years, when he will be leading, I see him being assertive in terms of championing the interests of the developing countries, Africa and the other countries in the developing world, especially making that viewpoint to the West, that all of us are part of this planet, are part of this world, and we must respect each other, and our voice as developing countries should be there at the decision-making table. I see him making that assertion. I also see him championing and strengthening partnerships.
Yes.
Meaningful partnerships.
Because he talked about in his opening remarks.
Yes, within the NAM countries and the global south, but also with the West, with the West. And his view has been that Africa and the developing countries will not develop because of aid, but rather trade and partnerships and investment. And he's going to push that cause to attract, especially the developed world where they have resources. Can they come and invest?
Now let's talk about the styles, the different styles of engagement. How do you see these different styles of engagement that China has with, for example, Africa as opposed to the West?
Yes, China has a strong association with the NAM and the G77, like we say G77 plus China. China is a very strong associate of the global south, of the developing countries. And we do appreciate that association. But also we work closely with the Western world. There is no animosity or hostility or hatred to speak of. There is that global partnership that exists and is very impactful. The West, like we've said, sometimes can have a character that attempts to force their opinions on the global south, on the political opinions, their views. They want to over-influence and impose. Yes, the West provides support, technical support, financial support, but at times there are those strings attached trying to impose their views, which we must respectfully resist. Because yes, I may be poor, but don't make me desperate that I must take whatever you are pushing on my throat, even when it's not swallowable or palatable to me. Now, when you go to the side of China, China also relates, but is not as imposing as the West is in terms of their views. They may have their own local domestic political views, but they don't impose them on the global south countries. They do not. They may have their own politics with the Western world, but that does not in any way affect us. The only difference probably is when you look at the Bretton Woods institutions, World Bank, IMF, the kind of support they extend to most of these countries, their processes are quite bureaucratic. You can approve a loan request here in the cabinet and parliament, and it takes you 1 more year before you get resources because of the bureaucracy that they put. The terms are quite harsh for our countries. Whereas resources, say, from the China Exim Bank, they are faster. You do the country processes, within 2 or 3 months, you have resources and you are able to implement.
Thank you so much, Honorable Minister, for having accepted to be with us and shed more light on these two very, very important summits that took place here in Uganda. And we do hope that the discussions will continue to take place, and we do hope that positive results will continue to accrue from these summits to benefit Africa, but also the entire development world. Back to you, Beatrice.
Indeed, Edward, thank you very much. Well, we are going to take a short break now, and when we come back, we will unpack the outcomes and significance of the non-aligned movement and G77 plus China summits. To stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Joining me now are from Beijing, Professor John Gong, Vice President of Research and Strategy at the University of International Business and Economics in Israel, and also a China Forum expert. From Kampala, Joseph Ochieno, an African affairs commentator. Joseph, let me start off with you here. The 19th non-aligned movement and G77 plus China summits recently concluded in Uganda. How do you perceive the overall impact of the two groupings on global dynamics over the years?
I have been generally very of the view that both movements, particularly the non-aligned movement, seem to have lost focus in the more recent times. But that said, in terms of the founding principles of both organizations, they're absolutely excellent organizations for the global south. Where we are today, though, on the basis of whatever happened in Kampala, and including their resolutions, it would appear that the contemporary globe, in terms of political reality, is such that, well, these groups and these organizations are far much more urgently in need than ever before. So really, with the Kampala Declaration, including the realities of what is happening in the Middle East and what's happened recently in Europe, and of course what is happening, particularly the contradictions within Africa as a continent itself, I think the leaders have suddenly woken up, and I really hope they have, to the reality that they need to come together, work together, but of course, most importantly, make sure that whatever declarations come up, that they're implemented. Implementation has generally really been the biggest thing. But of course, that said again, right, it is the case that regardless of whether or not they're able to implement, to make sure that most of the member countries don't only say what they say, but make sure that they participate within the provisions of the agreements.
Professor Gong, let me get your view here. Has the non-aligned movement and the G77 plus China lost focus in recent times? Do these meetings now show a resurgence of the global south?
Well, I think the non-alliance movement, got a little bit pushed away by the geopolitical developments in recent years, particularly in the context of China-United States competition. But I think, this movement has always been something that the developing world hold true to their heart. And I think China is also a strong and faithful supporter of that. I think, China's foreign policy has always had the non-alignment movement at the center of its foreign policy. So I think, it's not going to go away. It's not going away. And I think, this should be one of the most important principles guiding each country's foreign policy, in terms of dealing bilateral relationships between countries.
So, Joseph, let me come back to that collaboration among the G77 plus China. In what ways, though, does the G77 plus China collaboration, how does that address the specific needs and the concerns of the developing nations, particularly of African countries?
That's very interesting, Beatrice. I've suggested actually that one of the biggest benefits Africa particularly could could receive from China away from actually the material practical gains is simply experience. That China of 45 years ago is a very different China. How did it do? And how did it do it? And what exactly did it do? What is it that the rest of African countries did not do that China managed to do? So there are lessons to learn from that. But beyond that, of course, China is extremely ambitious. Beyond the size of its population, it substantially recognizes it wants to uplift the entirety of its population. Africa could learn from China from that perspective. But that said, of course, China's continued active participation in the global polity, one, and two, number two, in, if you like, the UN agencies, and then number three, is active participation in agencies like BRICS, means that China does not only participate as a member, but as a member with the experience, a member also that is able to come with the resources, skills, technology, and in that sense, it is the case that it would be an absolutely big win-win for both sides. I think it's really up to African countries to learn and clear their houses and make sure that actually whatever they do, they learn lessons. In this case, I generally say, and I've always said so, that I think the continent needs a leadership that is able to speak with a much more cohesive voice.
So let's look at the potential, Professor, of the Global South, because the Global South represents like 85% of the world's population and nearly 39% of global GDP. And yet, global institutions still reflect the realities of the global North that built them some 80 years ago. Has the Global South really achieved its objectives through the two groupings, the non-aligned movement and the G77 plus China?
Well, I think it has a lot to do with the economic power by the Global South. I think, you know, in the current world order, certainly, you know, these wealthy countries, the Western countries hold a lot of say over international and global matters. But nevertheless, we all know that even from an economic perspective, the Global South represents the future. If you look at the demographic change, for example, you know, the population growth in Africa is larger than anywhere else in the world, actually, right? So what it means is that there will be more economic opportunities, more development opportunities associated with these countries and regions that are seeing these strong demographic growth. China continues to keep a very good relationship with these countries and also invests a lot in these countries. And again, I would say particularly in Africa. You know, China's investments across the African continent is probably the largest country among the world. You know, you see so many companies and personnel, executives, management people, and also individual business people, you know, going to Africa and you know, develop economic opportunities in Africa together with friends over there.
Joseph, I want to bring you in here because I want to find out exactly how you see the Global South being able to actualize, you know, global reform. Because as you've alluded, the system remains unfair, the system remains, you know, outdated, and it remains dysfunctional.
I think all that we need to do is basically make sure that we use whatever opportunity we've got amongst ourselves, trade amongst ourselves more, make sure that we do more value addition, make sure that we create opportunities for our people, make sure that perhaps we push, and I think Ugandan president pushed for this, an element of stability, minimizing conflict, which means therefore our resources go to less defense spending, but much more to public services, much more to investments. And the more we do so, the more we're able to minimize debt, which is basically part of the biggest challenge facing most African countries and indeed most of the countries in the Global South. Whatever it is the case anyway, China at the moment is doing very well, and it managed to, if you like, navigate within the base of its own resources and its own skills. Africa particularly continues to have the biggest amount of natural resources. I think generally, as I said, with the leadership and technology from both China and in the global north, which are available anyway, there is no reason why, you know, we do not become a very different continent in the next 10 to 20 years. And there is really no reason why the Global South holistically, including lessons from South America, which seem to have done slightly better, and indeed Southeastern Asia. There's no reason why we don't really experience a different world. What is most urgent, though, is how we're able to do all this by, at the same time, minimizing challenges of climate change and global warming, part of which is a contradiction within and with industrialization, as it were.
Mm-hmm. So I want to look at China's role here as it galvanizes global economic growth together with Africa. How do you see China's role, though, in reshaping the global system?
Well, I think China's cooperation with that part of the world generates benefits for both sides. I think what China can bring to the table includes, for example, technologies, management skills, capital, people, and I think not many companies in the world so much eager to go to Africa, to be deeply rooted in Africa, to call Africa home, right? To build infrastructures there, to set up ventures there, to set up manufacturing operations, and being part of the industrialization process in these countries. And many Chinese companies are actually doing that.
Right. So I want to get your final thoughts, Professor, because the non-aligned movement, G77 plus China summits have just concluded. Last year, the BRICS group expanded to include more members. Countries are looking at using local currencies for trade, bypassing the US dollar. Are these strong enough headwinds, though, to reshape the global order?
We know for a fact that de-dollarization is happening to some extent. I think other currencies' weight in total international trade settlement has been increasing. For example, if you look at the China's RMB's transaction amount as part of the total SWIFT transactions percentage, it's just been doubled to more than 4%. It's already surpassed Japanese yen. I also know, for example, within the BRICS framework, there's a working group set up to explore the possibility of trade settlements using alternative currency other than United States dollar. This may not be a one country's particular currency. For example, China's RMB. It could be maybe a synthetic currency. At least, a working group is working to explore, what our options are to study this issue. So I think, there'll be many countries behind that, very interested in that scenario. For example, Brazil is very interested in that. So I think, I think eventually de-dollarization is indeed happening, and eventually, at least I think the dollar's dominant role will be curtailed a little bit. Just like British pound did historically.
Now, Joseph, in the last year, we have seen attempts at inclusion, with the African Union joining the G20 group of economies and Sub-Saharan Africa getting a third seat on the IMF executive board. Can these drive structural changes in the global governance system?
Extremely important that, yes, it is happening and it's real, including the manner in which most of these countries and, if you like, these agencies are reasserting themselves. One of the most impressive is the recent position taken by South Africa on the question of Arab-Israeli conflict, and including taking on Israel in a very particular way, as it were. I think the more we're able to do that, the louder it will be the case that we are here. But at the same time, it's important that actually there's much more coordination by these nations. And as I said, it's not about them versus us, but it's very much about harnessing the best of what we have to engage with the global community.
Very insightful discussion there, but that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to all our guests. The Honorable Dr. Chris Baryomunsi, Ugandan Minister for ICT and National Guidance. Professor John Gong, Vice President of Research and Strategy at the University of International Business and Economics in Israel, and also a China Forum expert. And Joseph Ochieno, African Affairs commentator. And thank you to Edward Rukidi Kijanangoma and the entire team at the Uganda Broadcasting Corporation. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation online through our social media handles on Facebook and X, the platform formerly known as Twitter. You can also catch the show on our YouTube playlist. Do keep the conversation going and join us again next week for more Talk Africa. For me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi, it's goodbye for now.